Oh, yeah.
How you doing, everyone? Oh, there's a contradiction inherent there because Sydney, we've all observed that you like sitting near the sunlight, that you're a creature of the sun, but it's also really cold outside, which means you're closer to the spot of the coldness. You're trying to access warmth, but you're freezing at the same time.
Yes, it's very much contradictory.
Like get you like an ultraviolet heat lamp, set that up somewhere.
Be so thoughtful. I would appreciate that.
All right. Just little things that we try to do for students. All right, today we're going to talk about Jack Greenberg Incorporated, and we're also going to talk about the Trolley Dodgers. A little bit of background on this series of cases is that we do cover inventory and payroll processes in undergraduate auditing, but I don't think that those go into nearly as much depth as some of the other sections. So I wanted to actually look at some cases that were relevant to those particular areas. And the Trolley Dodgers case is kind of an afterthought. I do think it's an interesting case, but it's basically like a 10-minute case. It's something that I expect to spend 10 minutes talking about. I really like the Jack Greenberg case because not only is it an inventory management case, but it also introduces some new concepts and things that you have to think about. One of the goals that I always set forth for any of my classes, and I tell the students this whenever they're taking a course, whenever they're thinking about how to approach questions, is not to think about something from the facts and details that we learn in the class, but can you actually learn something that's conceptually applicable to other scenarios? And the way that I describe this is I remember that I took accounting, and I was not a good student. I took accounting, then I dropped out of school, and I took accounting, then I dropped out of school, and I took accounting again. But I remember enough, my third time around, I remember thinking, I don't remember any of this, but then it just kind of all came to me. Even if I couldn't remember the exact scenario or the exact circumstances that I needed to approach something, I could conceptually determine based on, kind of my application or critical thinking, what the reasonable approach to a particular problem was. And that's kind of when I became enamored with this learning process. Obviously, it took me a lot longer than it should have. Thankfully for everybody in this room, it's not going to take you all nearly as long. But I do think it's really important to be able to understand, even if you don't know exactly how to apply a particular question in a given scenario, you have the knowledge that you can become up with an educated approach. And that's the prepaid inventory, I think, was a very interesting twist on that, because that's not something that I'd ever encountered before in any of my auditing. It's not something that's very common. How would you audit prepaid inventory? And I thought that was some interesting questions we have today, is to talk a little bit about prepaid inventory and the auditing approach for that. So before we get started on Jack Greenberg and talk about the nature of this company, let's go a little bit of background. We've got this family-owned business, and named after the owner, Jack Greenberg, and it's being run by his sons, Manny and Fred. And Manny and Fred are just they're very devoted sons, which that's something we can say to them. They want to make sure that they make their dad proud. Now, the question is whether or not they made their dad proud by finding out this massive financial statement fraud was going on. But they kind of felt they had no scenario in which to otherwise succeed. So the business was pretty reasonably successful for a while, but then they started realizing that they were getting priced out of the market. They're trying to provide these luxury goods, these luxury products, and it's like meats was kind of their primary supply, but whatever the inventory they're providing, it's imported from other countries and then brought into the United States and then held and then sold. And at the time when the business was started, it wasn't a big deal that everybody kind of had those on the same playing field. But now these big retailers were able to move into this market and do it at a fraction of the cost. And we've talked a little bit about that in the concept of auditing. When your industry becomes more competitive, when you start having the threat of new entrants to the industry and they start pricing out of the market, that definitely represents an inherent risk to an organization. And so this was a risk that they did not respond to favorably. Instead of saying, all right, we need to have better controls to make sure that we're properly stating things, they said, all right, we need to commit a fraud so that we can retain the appearance of profitability. And so, they had a very interesting system that they put together. And I say interesting in the fact that it's basically the same type of fraud with inventory that we've seen in many other scenarios. But the key to this, the twist on this one, was the differentiation between prepaid inventory and merchandise inventory, or whenever they receive that. So as we discussed, I talked with a few groups about this on Monday. it was not particularly difficult to understand how the system was supposed to work. Basically, they're paying for inventory in advance, and once it's shipped to them, then it gets recognized as actual inventory in their system. But before that, up until that point, it's like any other prepaid asset that expects to be used. So it's like basically a prepaid asset, in this case, prepaid inventory. Now, it's a little bit different from other prepaid assets, and that other prepaid assets tend to be more service oriented. Like we think about prepaid insurance, or we think about prepaid rent. Those are more service based, and you you use them or you consume them as they're used. So if you pay for rent 6 months in advance, then you consume it 1 month at a time or something along those lines. Prepaid inventory is a little bit more straightforward. It's like we're paying for it now. We have the right to receive this inventory. Once the inventory is received, it's reclassified as inventory, actual inventory. But at its core level, it's just basically a prepaid asset. Now, the inventory fraud itself was not all that complex. Basically, what was happening is they were overstating their prepaid inventory, which had the effect of basically making their net income larger. So I want to go back a little bit to talk about something that many of you know and love back from 221. This is back my hoorah, back when I last taught 221, which I guess was spring 2022 was I think the last time I taught it. Is the base formula, okay? This is kind of my own creation. I used to call this the Holy Grail equation because I was so fond of this equation because you use it everywhere. But then I said, let's not make it more than it actually is. Let's call it something simple. It's going to be a base formula. And so that's beginning plus additions equal minus subtractions equal ending. And the key to any mathematical formula is you can rearrange the parts and come up with the any number. So if you have 3 of these, you can solve for the 4th. And in this particular scenario, as was the case when we talked about this back in 221, beginning plus additions minus ending equals subtractions, or beginning inventory plus purchases minus ending inventory equals cost of goods sold. Now, that's all there really was to this fraud. It sounds like a classification fraud, and it sounds like, wow, this is really, really extreme, prepaid inventory merchant. No, it was very, very basic fraud. All that was happening is that Fred Greenberg was effectively just increasing this number right here, okay? Just increasing the ending inventory. Now, how was he doing that? He was destroying the delivery receipts. So whenever the prepaid inventory was received, it was not acknowledged as being reduced in prepaid inventory. Instead, it was shifted from merchandise inventory. So merchandise inventory was counting it, and prepaid inventory was also counting it. So it's just double counting. Very, very simplistic, straightforward fraud. And so, what happens when this goes on? So this is where I wanted to actually go. It's like created this entire spreadsheet just for this purpose. What happens when you increase ending inventory? So remember, the base formula is like beginning plus additions, which is going to be our purchases, minus ending inventory determines cost of goods sold. So if I increase this to $8 million, so that number goes up, okay? The cost of goods sold goes down. Cost of goods sold goes down. So if cost of goods sold goes down, what does that do to our income? Increases our income, okay? So that's all there really is to that fraud. And this is a very simple fraud that many organizations have perpetrated, there we go, perpetrated previously. It's just a little bit more subtle because of the nature of prepaid inventory. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we would approach auditing prepaid inventory, but we have to know going into this is a risk. If they overstate their prepaid inventory, then they're going to be effectively double counting this, and that's going to have an effect on income. And this probably should have been identified to the auditors as a very high risk area from the get-go. Simply because when we think about the nature of inventory, our very first concern is, does inventory exist? So this should have been something that I believe it was Grant Thornton, was it who's the auditor? BDO or Grant Thornton? Grant Thornton. You tell I've been doing a lot of cases, so I can't remember who's who. But Grant Thornton should have anchored on this and said, all right, this is obviously one of our big ones. This is the core of their business line. Need to pick that up. Now, to their credit, they did have a little bit of an argument, said that they just got a new CFO in who was very concerned about updating or outdated business processes. So Steve Cohn came in and he was like saying, we need to modernize this. We need to get this all computerized. And what did Fred say in response to Steve Cohn with respect to modernizing prepaid inventory? He said, no, I refuse, okay? And Steve says, why? And Fred said, because I'm perpetuating a massive financial statement fraud and computerizing will unravel the whole thing. He didn't actually say that, but that was the reason, okay? That was the whole reason behind this. So yeah, keeping that in mind, when we start talking about the nature of the fraud, we want to understand how that relates to all this. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that Grant Thornton probably should have done, which is easiest for us to say after the fact that this is something they should have done. But some of this was pretty low-hanging fruit. All right, so question number one. Question number 1 says, identify important audit risk factors common to family-owned businesses and how should their auditors identify these risk factors? Okay, so trying to remember who the key group leaders are. So Dylan, I think you were one of the group leaders, Kirsten, and then Madeline and Kyle. All right, so is that right? Am I crazy? Okay, are you guys kind of frowning? It's like Dylan's like, was I one of the group leaders? That's not okay. Well, we'll let you sort through who the group leader is, and I'm going to call in Kirsten. Okay, what did your group identify for some of the risk factors in family-owned businesses?
Internal.
Well, typically family-owned business or small business don't have like a lot of people in them, so there's like a lack of segregation of duties or like just internal controls in general.
Sure. So let's talk about kind of what we think about controls, because controls, I think, are one of the biggest concerns in this area. When we talk about audit risk factors, is going to be, obviously, we could say they had inherent risk associated with their specific line of business, but we're talking more about just family-owned business in general. And you kind of hit the nail on the head, is that controls are going to be the big one. All right. So first of all, if I were to characterize the control environment of most of these family-owned businesses, how would you characterize most family-owned business control environments in all likelihood? Probably non-existent. They're probably like, yeah, we're just a mom and pop establishment. We don't know the fancy controls. Like if I went over to Greek Corneros and I said, hey, can you give me a breakdown of how your controls, control components according to the COSO framework look? They'd be like looking at me like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? What on earth are you discussing? We've never heard those things. We make euros here. All right. That's what they'd say. So obviously it's a little bit bigger family-owned business, but it should be something that was very concerning, because in a family-owned business, there's going to be this pervasive error of we're just doing something very simple and straightforward. So control environment. Then we talked about missing or diminished control activities. And you pointed out one that I'm very fond of. And I don't know if you picked that out just simply because you know that I'm fond of it or because you thought it was really prevalent, but both are correct. Segregation of duties. All right. Segregation of duties is certainly problematic, because if you're a family environment, it's like, well, dad will take care of that or Fred will take care of that. It's not a big deal. Okay. So by the way, we're going to have to focus on segregation of duties, because that was a big contention point in this case. And we want to talk a little bit about that. Also, what can we say? What is the purpose of controls? What was one of the very first things we talked about back when we learned auditing, the nature of controls? Why do we even bother with controls in an organization? I mean, obviously, controls help improve assurance that transactions are processed properly, but can't the auditor just do it at the end and basically say, well, the financial statements are wrong, we're going to make adjustments, and now the financial statements are right? That's what they used to do. And then Sarbanes-Oxley Act said, no, you've got to do controls. You've got to have controls in place. What was the whole goal of the controls? So another word for visibility that I'm really, really fond of talking about in auditing. Transparency, okay? In a family-owned business, there's going to be a lack of external transparency, because they're just basically going to say, we know what's going on, you don't need to worry about it, okay? So I think there's some real concerns with respect to controls in the operation of the business environment. But yeah, controls are going to be a very big one with respect to the family-owned business. Right? Can we still who the?
It was me.
Okay, cool. Did we get the integrative thing submitted for?
I did just submit it.
Okay, all right. We had okay. That's okay. That's okay. I know it was an unintentional oversight. Okay. But yeah, if you need me to, I can throw your group members under the bus and say it's their fault.
No, it definitely wasn't.
Okay.
For some reason, I thought it was Holden. I don't know why. I think it's just because he emailed saying I was going to be there.
He just had imposing group leader.
Yeah. No, he was the group leader, even if I was leader on the bus.
All right. All right. So let's go ahead and move on to question 2. In your opinion, what primary audit objectives should Grant Thornton have established for JGI's prepaid inventory and for merchandise inventory? So we're going to talk about both of these, but let's go talk about the easy one first. Okay, let's talk about merchandise inventory. I almost called it Holden. Dylan, what's your group identify for merchandise inventory as being some primary concerns, more primary objectives?
We said existence occurrence, ensuring that the merchandise inventory exists and isn't double counted.
Yep. So if we're talking about both of those combined, is there another assertion that we probably should keep in mind as well? I know we're talking about these separately, but if I combine the two, is there another assertion that we probably should consider?
VAA.
Well, VAA, but like VAA is kind of a supplemental one that we would test as part of existing occurrence. So what is the difference between prepaid inventory and merchandise inventory? Is that an important question? Okay, what would that relate to? What assertion? What management assertion? Anybody? Classification. Yeah, classification is what we're going to talk about. All right. So, existence and classification, I think, are relevant. And I think that's relevant, but also to prepaid inventory. I think we can actually talk about that. Existence particularly relevant since we don't have the visibility of the prepaid inventory, so it's kind of difficult to identify whether or not it truly exists because it's more of a prepaid asset as opposed to being an actual inventory item. So existence becomes really challenging. One other assertion that I think is probably relevant here, and it's more relevant to prepaid inventory than it would be to merchandise inventory. I think I said cutoff, okay, given the nature of the fraud. Try can recognize when the delivery receipts are actually took place. So again, the whole fraud was predicated on destroying the delivery receipts. So if we know when the prepaid inventory is actually received, then we can actually recognize the proper transition to merchandise inventory. So yeah, good identification there. Assess Grant Thornton's decision to rely heavily on JGI's delivery receipts when auditing the company's prepaid inventory. More generally, comparing addressability to audit and shield by internally prepared versus externally prepared client documents. All right, Kyle, I'm going to pick on you. What does your group think on this one?
We said that they relied too heavily on documents provided by JGI and not other documents, and they failed to verify that they reflected what was in the prepaid inventory account. They could have gotten documents from sellers, for example, to verify what was actually shipped and ordered.
Yes, so some very important takeaways from there. So we talked about the nature of delivery receipts. Are delivery receipts created by the client or created externally? I thought that was the easy question. So delivery receipts, were they created by JGI or were they created by some other party? That, but the other one.
Oh, them.
Yeah, they were created by JGI. Yeah, JGI. So they're created by JGI. So what do we know about the nature of internally generated documents?
It's not as persuasive.
Not as persuasive as external evidence. Okay. Do we have external evidence? Okay, so I talked about the form 9540-1. I think I called it 9540-I on Monday, but form 9540-I, which is kind of an import receipt, which actually documented all the receipt of all the merchandise. That's kind of convenient because that's an external piece of evidence, whereas we were relying on internal pieces of evidence. Now, we talked about the audit or the reliability mnemonic, okay, AEIO and then U, which we're going to ignore U because I don't want to say it. But AEIO, auditor generated evidence, externally generated evidence, internally generated evidence, oral evidence. All right. We're talking about the spectrum that internal evidence is going to be lower reliability. Why is internal evidence lower reliability than external evidence?
The client tampered with.
The client tampered it. It's a possibility. Is it possible that happened in this particular fraud here? They in fact did tamper with the evidence. Okay, so we know that internally generated evidence is problematic because the client could mess with it, and that's in fact what happened. Very hard to do that for external evidence. If we have those form 9540-I or -1, I did it again. 9540-1. I'm just going to call it form 9. Okay, form 9. So if we have that form, it's a lot easier, especially if we can get that directly from the I don't remember what the governmental agency was that prepared it. USDA. Okay, if we get that directly from the USDA, then it's a lot easier to audit. Now, there's a little bit of rigmarole that goes on in the case. Is like basically they found out about this much later after the audit. They've been auditing for like 8 years, and they said, "Oh, this external document exists." Which I don't know if I'm Grant Thornton. I'm just kind of like, this is like the first question I'd ask is like, is there some other document that can verify this? Because internal receipts are problematic. But they found out, it says, okay, we'd like to use those documents next year. And then basically what happened is they came back in and they had this big stack of documents and Fred's like, here you go. You know, and it's like, oh my gosh, we are never going to be able to get through all of this. And they couldn't make heads or tails of it, which that's where they should have been going from the first place. And I would have been Grant Thornton. I would have been like, hey, this is not just something that we need to audit, but you need to have some sort of organization protocol for this. And Fred had been like, I can't do that because if I organize this, you're going to discover I'm creating a fraud. Okay. So that was kind of the justification. Red flags all around. Now here's something very interesting. All right. What was the justification that Grant Thornton gave for relying on the delivery receipts as a form of evidence? There was a really important point made in the case. Did anybody catch it? Because it says on page 195, let's see, page 195. All right. About halfway through the page, Grant Thornton believed it was acceptable to rely on delivery receipts to verify the date of delivery because JGI's internal control procedures for inventory were based on the system of segregation of duties. All right. Did we just identify something that's problematic about family-owned businesses with respect to segregation of duties? Yeah, segregation of duties doesn't usually exist in family-owned businesses. Now, there's the argument saying they're modernizing, they've got the new CFO who's coming in and fixing everything, and that's the case. But I'd like to read a little bit of a section here that's in part page 192, okay? If you've got the book, you can read along with me. It's the bottom page 192. Upon completion of the USDA inspection process, the prepaid inventory items are turned over to the manager of JGI's warehouse. The warehouse manager stamped the items to indicate they had passed the USDA inspection and completed a document known as the delivery receipt that listed the day of the arrival, the vendor, the product, and the quantity of the product. The warehouse manager then sent a delivery receipt form to Fred Greenberg, who matched the form with the appropriate vendor invoice. Fred then deleted the given inventory items from the prepaid inventory log and forwarded the matched inventory delivery receipt to Steve process an accounting entry to transfer the product from prepaid inventory to the merchandise inventory account. All right. So that was basically the detail they gave. Does anybody see a problem with that description right there? So even though it seems like, okay, there's a separation of responsibilities, there's 3 people involved, okay? There's the warehouse manager who's got the custody of the inventory. Then there's Fred who's responsible for the authorization, and Steve's responsible with the recording. Steve can only record until once Fred gives the information to him. So effectively, the recording is being curtailed at that point. He can't actually do the recording function. Effectively speaking, because Fred has power over when the information gets recorded, he has that custody responsibility. If he just never delivers the information, then it never gets recorded. And that's in fact what happened in the scenario, is that basically Fred took over that recording function saying, all right, I'm just going to destroy the delivery receipt and the recording can't happen. So the authorization and recording occur simultaneously. Is that problematic? Authorization and recording are basically in the hands of one person? Yes, we know that from segregation of duties that we've already talked about. So they say the responsibilities of segregation of duties, but they might have wanted to look a little bit further and say, this isn't really segregation of duties. This is basically one person has authorization and recording responsibility. So it's certainly problematic in that regard. All right, moving on to question 4. Describe the general nature and purpose of a walkthrough audit procedure. Are such tests required by professional auditing standards? Boy, sounds like we may have just talked about this recently, huh? What do you think, Madeline? What's your group say?
We said that it's to be able to go through like the internal control process and kind of feel out how it functions, and that it helps auditors understand the client's business and identify potential risks.
Yes. So it's a mixture of all the procedures that we talked about with respect to control. So mixtures of inspection records and documents, observation, and inquiry. Where we say a transaction, we talk about the inception of the transaction and walk it through the entire internal controls process to see where it hits the books. Very, very powerful audit procedure because it shows exactly what happens at every stage of the audit and what controls are hit. Would this have been a very, very potent procedure if the Grant Thornton had relied on this in this particular scenario? Probably so, because they would have seen the bottleneck that was occurring and what was happening at the prepaid inventory and said, all right, we don't have proof of fraud, but if a fraud could occur, it could occur right here in this manual process of prepaid inventory that's not part of the computerized system because it's not subject to the same controls or restraints. In effect, a walkthrough would have been very, very potent in this particular scenario. All right. Identify audit procedures other than a walkthrough test that might have resulted in Grant Thornton discovering that Fred Greenberg is tampering with JGI's delivery receipts. All right. So there's a few of them we can talk about here. Let's do a few for each group, or one for each group to start out with. So Kirsten, I started with you. What's one that your group identified?
Like a physical inspection, like the inventory.
Okay. So physical inspection inventory would have been good for the merchandise inventory verification. Obviously, we can't do that for the prepaid inventory because it's being held off site in the premises, but that would have been a really good starting point for sure. Dylan, what else? Another one?
We talked about confirmation, but using it to request vendor receipts for prepaid balances to figure out what was purchased earlier.
Yeah, so that was a challenging one, but trying to figure out how we use confirmations for the prepaid balances. Now, I had a little conversation with one of the groups about this and said it's a little bit weird. But this would be confirmation. It's a little bit more in the nature of trying to validate a payable as opposed to trying to validate a receivable because it's prepaid in nature. But for sure, you'd have it a third party, and you could make a third party request and say, all right, what is the outstanding balance? And they would say, all right, it's $10,000. That's interesting because it says, according to Fred Greenberg, you have $20,000 outstanding. And they'd say, well, Fred Greenberg's a liar, all right? And in fact, he was, all right? So that way it works out. Any others that we can identify? There's a few others I got listed here. Kyle, what'd your group say?
They said they could have performed a recalculation to figure out what the prepaid inventory should have been.
Yeah, so recalculation would have been a good step. I think that it would have been a little bit of a challenge because of the nature of the split computerized manual systems. But I think that was already a pretty obvious red flag there. Madeline, do you group identify anything else?
We had also said confirmation, but we also said vouching.
Okay. So I do think that the vouching step, especially if we look at the start of the vouching procedure, if we start with the inventory and go back to the 9540-1 documents, if we go to those as a source documents, that would have been a very quick one. We could identify that there's a problem there. So vouching step would have worked if we had the 9541-1 documents. A couple others I identified that I think are relevant. Are there any parties that we think we could have, if Grant Thornton had made a basic inquiry of, that might have provided some evidence? So the warehouse manager saying, yeah, it's really weird. Fred is always in my face and just kind of saying that this doesn't actually, that we didn't actually receive this when I know that we did receive it because it's sitting right here. That might have been a very interesting one to have talk with the warehouse manager. Maybe talking to Steve Cohen, say, I am doing my best to try to update this because we are living in the 90s and he still wants to do inventory like we're back in the 60s. I think Grant Thornton probably talked to Steve Cohen many times and got really frustrated about the whole thing. But that would have been a really good inquiry. Interesting one, analytical procedures. Could those have been helpful? Over the long term, I think so. So what do we know? So we've been learning about this semester. Many of us have been learning about it. Some people already know all this stuff. The ones who already know, don't spoil it for everybody else. But what do we know about the nature of fraud? Is fraud just one of those things that happens one time and goes away? It tends to be very perpetuating. It tends to be perpetuating over time. Do we think that that's probably the case with this particular fraud right here? So if I overstate inventory in one period, I have to continue to overstate inventory in subsequent periods. And if a fraud is basically, if we're running into the same problems as previous years, it's not something that's going to simply fix itself because margins were on the decline. So what do you have to continue to do? You have to continue to overstate inventory every period, which basically means that your ending inventory gets larger and larger over time. If I do a simple trend analysis over a period of 5 years, I said, well, back in 1990, the ending inventory was $1 million. Now we look at 1995, ending inventory is $150 billion. Now I'm kind of curious why we have this change in ending inventory. That seems like a little bit of an extreme example. Obviously, those are really silly numbers to make up, but the whole point is that there would be a dramatic difference between inventory numbers early on in the fraud and later in the fraud, and that should have been a very, very clear signal. All right, question number 6. Once an audit firm has informed client management of important internal control weaknesses, what further responsibility, if any, does the audit firm have regarding those items? For example, does the audit firm have a responsibility to assist the client manager of correct deficiencies or address them in some other way? What do you guys think? We'll go back to Kirsten. What'd your group say on this one?
Talking about question 8 or
Question 6. Yeah, question 8 would be hard. We don't have question 8. So.
yeah. This one was tricky for me. I was getting confused. So the auditor should discuss with management to figure out their intended response. They should also assess whether the management's response adequately addresses the risk identified.
Yep. So let's talk just very generally about control deficiencies, all right? What do we know about control deficiencies under Public Company Accounting Oversight Board standards, PCAOB auditing standards? Do we have a responsibility to report that information to management? Any control deficiencies identified? Answer is absolutely 100% yes, okay? If a control deficiency identified, that gets reported to management and says, yeah, this is something you should probably fix. Depending on the severity of the control deficiency, it can actually affect the opinion, all right? If it's a significant deficiency, then something that in future periods could very much affect opinion, and we need to report that to the audit committee. And then material weakness is something that says that's basically saying the controls are not effective. That's what we say there's an adverse opinion on internal controls. Now, so control deficiencies do have to be communicated pretty thoroughly and clearly by the auditor, regardless of the level of deficiency. And these are things that we expect management to focus on and address between one period and the next. Now, that being said, I did talk about PCAOB. When did this case take place? Was it before or after the PCAOB was founded? It was before, it was well before. This case was in the 90s. The PCAOB was not created until 2004, all right? So it was not really held to public accounting auditing standards. So what does that probably imply the approach that Grant Thornton probably used in some of these areas? So When we talk about two types of strategies, Grant Thornton probably used what is strategy with respect to prepaid inventory? Do they rely heavily on controls, you think? I would like to think that they relied heavily on controls, but it seems like that they did not have as strong a controlled reliance as they did. So I would say that they may have employed a substantive strategy in some of their process areas, which for the prepaid inventory makes sense because it was not a computerized environment. It was a manual environment, and they may just said, let's just make sure the final number is correct. That's all they're going to be doing. Should they have been employing test controls in this area? Absolutely. This is a heavy transaction area and important area for the business. They did, I make the argument, said we did identify segregation of duties in this area. So we did look at controls in this area. But given the lack of real transparency with respect to segregation of duties, I have a hard time believing that they really effectively tested this. This one's just one of those areas that I'm just a little bit skeptical. I have professional skepticism about this. Let's just put it that way. All right, so that's Jack Greenberg. All right, now I said we're going to talk about Trolley Dodgers, which is kind of like a 10-minute, which we got 16 minutes. So it's a 16-minute case, all right? So anybody know about the Trolley Dodgers before they read this case? They know that the Los Angeles Dodgers used to be the Brooklyn Trolley Dodgers. So I'm reminded, has anybody ever watched the movie Basketball? It's by the guys who wrote South Park. And it's a little bit of an older movie. It's like the early 2000s. It is very irreverent, like anything you expect from the South Park creators. But there's one scene that's very funny because it's about a sports movie. It's talking about how sports has become so focused on monetary profit and money, and that they said basically they made team moves that made no sense. Like Minnesota Lakers moved to Los Angeles where there are no lakes, and the New Orleans Jazz moved to Utah where music's not allowed. Okay. And so I think Los Angeles Dodgers, the origin of the name is the Trolley Dodgers, and there's no trolleys in Los Angeles, okay? But it makes sense in Brooklyn back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when trolleys were a very, very popular form of conveyance. So yeah, Dodgers name. All I know is that my sister-in-law, she wears the Los Angeles Dodgers hat all the time, and she has no clue about baseball. She just likes it because LA are her initials. So yeah. Anyway. Going down a bit of a rabbit hole there. So, got this payroll system created by Edward Campos, and Dodger organization person for life. And he was so devoted that he never took a vacation. And so, man, that must be a sign of integrity and enthusiasm and detail there. Is that at all a red flag? Yeah, that's certainly problematic. Okay, so some red flags that we identified in this case. Obviously, Campos never took a vacation, and we've seen similar scenarios like this. Not saying that people didn't take vacation, but when vacations do happen, a lot of these fraudsters say, hey, nobody touch anything until I get back. I will take care of this. Do not put your hands on it. There was no protocol for anybody to address this. But the big problem with Campos' payroll system is that even if there had been somebody assigned to do it, they could not have done it. Why? Because nobody understood Campos' payroll system. He was the only person that understood it, which is kind of a big red flag right there. If nobody else understands how it works, then the responsibilities are going to be not very clear and transparent. So how are the auditors going to understand what's going on? The answer is they didn't. All right, they didn't. So yeah, Campos created this massive fraud. I shouldn't say massive fraud. It was pretty minor compared to the size of the organization, but still a fraud in payroll that's relevant here. So let's go ahead and talk about the little bit of Trolley Dodgers we identified. So what are the key audit objectives for our client's payroll function? Comment the objectives related to test controls and substantive audit procedures. All right, so what do we think our primary assertion is in this area? Dylan, what'd your group say with respect to the primary management assertion over payroll function?
Existence occurrence.
Existence occurrence, yeah. We want to make sure that we're not making payments to fictitious employees, or that employees that exist are not receiving payments for what they do. And that sounds like such a simple thing to address, and you'd be so surprised about how frequently this occurs. Sometimes it's very, very subtle and nuanced. It's like, oh, I forgot to clock in, and then the organization will say, all right, well, we don't want you to get paid, so we're just going to add 5 hours to your paycheck. Okay, that happens all the time, and it's such a lack of such a lack of control over this area that it just gets abused massively. When I was working at KPMG back doing a data analytics, we actually did a data analysis of payroll function for one of our clients. And I actually saw an employee who charged 180 hours in 1 week. Charged 180 hours in 1 week. Does anybody see a small problem with that particular calculation? So 7 times 24 equals 168, okay? 180 hours unless they have Hermione's time turner is not really possible, okay? All right, so yeah. 180 hours. That was a big red flag. It says, oh, this person is very, very efficient. They can work 2 hours in the space of 1 hour. It's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. What about with respect to the nature of controls in this place? So does an auditor have responsibilities? Let me ask this way. Does an auditor have a requirement to test controls in this area? Is there a requirement? For public company audits, we may answer yes, but again, we're probably not talking public company, and even so, this is before the oversight of PCOB. The answer is no, there's not a requirement per se in any given area. Does the auditor have to have an understanding of internal controls? Yes, understanding is required in every scenario, whether we're talking about public company audit, private company audit. Auditor has to have an understanding of controls in this area. Do we know any facts about this case that might have made the auditor's understanding of controls in the payroll process difficult? No one but Campos understood the system, okay? That includes the auditors. If the auditors don't understand the system, can they actually effectively audit the system? No. They're probably relying very heavily on a substantive strategy after the fact, which is certainly problematic because that creates a real problem with transparency in the system. Also, in many organizations, they choose to outsource the payroll function. Now, I'm not going to say that was necessary in this particular system, but what would be some advantages of outsourcing payroll function? If you outsource the payroll function, then you have somebody who knows what they're doing, and you don't have to worry about segregation of duties within your own organization. But if you outsource the function, what is something that's required in most service organization providings? To complement that, since we can't, as auditors, can't test the controls directly. What report do we have to get? SOC report. Okay, we have to get that SOC report. So there is a trade-off. Okay, we eliminate the need for segregation of duties in a particular process area if we eliminate that process area, but we do have to make sure the controls are operating effectively for whoever that's outsourced to. All right. What internal control weaknesses were evident in the Dodgers payroll system? Kyle, what's your group identify here?
Well, there was a severe lack of segregation of duties as Campos was doing the entire payroll system by himself.
Sure. Very good. That's the top one I've got. Any other control weaknesses we identified? So something about vacations. What was going on with vacations there? Campos never took them. Okay. Campers never took them. Like, yeah. So it wasn't until he got appendicitis that they actually had to take a closer look at the system because he was required to actually take some time off. So he didn't die. And then they finally said, oh, wait, this is really weird. This does not seem to work. Now, interestingly, the mandatory vacation policy is something that's in place in a lot of organizations just to make sure that there's a second check on many responsibilities. But segregation duties should have probably addressed that if there was proper segregation of duties in this area. Now, I do want to talk about something you may note. You may say, Dr. Barnes, wait a minute. Segregation of duties would not have been effective in this particular scenario. Is there an argument for that? There's an argument for that because we know that there are certain inherent limitations of internal controls. One of those was on display in this particular scenario. Which one am I talking about? Collusion. Yes, I saw you nodding your head, Matt. I was like, you know exactly where I'm going here. Yeah, he was colluding with other people in the organization. And we know that collusion is one of those inherent problems in controls, the inherent limitation of controls. Even if we had proper segregation of duties, it would have been rendered ineffective. I'm not saying that the segregation of duties should not exist. I'm saying that that the auditor should have been aware that this was also a potential problem and address that. It certainly was a lot easier for Campos to get away with simply because he did have control over the entire authority of the payroll system. All right, just real quick. Segregation duties is not always practical in many organizations. How many people have read about fraud at charitable organizations? This happens all the time, by the way. United Way has had like at least dozens of frauds. I shouldn't say at least. They've had dozens of frauds. Why do frauds occur at charitable organizations, do you think? So when you donate to charity, you basically hear about how much of your money is going to go to that charity, and you want that number to be really, really large. All right. What does that amount being large equate to with respect to administrative personnel who are overseeing your donation? They don't get paid, or there's a minimal amount of people who are actually getting it. You talk about an organization, a charitable organization, they probably don't have offices the size of a business. They're saying, we've got to generate 80% or 90% margins on our charity because otherwise people will not donate here. So we basically got 10% of everything that's donated that goes to administration. So it's basically operating on a skeleton crew. how possible is segregation of duties in a situation where you don't have very many personnel? If you got an organization that's being run by 2 people, can you segregate all the responsibilities effectively? Because remember, you have to separate 3 responsibilities out in segregation of duties. If you have only 2 people, that's really difficult. All right. So what is the solution to that? What is the solution to that? There's no more charities. No more charity donations of good customers. Not what I'm saying. Okay, it's not what I'm saying. Is there a possibility that we need to actually have that something else in place if segregation duties is not practical or possible? What would be a very simple solution to this? Maybe some sort of oversight or review of the process to make sure that there's an understanding of, even if there's no segregation of duties, that somebody sees the transactions that are being taking place and can review them. That would probably be a solution. This is actually, we talked about this back with Rita Crunwell. Does everybody remember Rita Crunwell from Dixon, Illinois? She didn't have segregation duties in her responsibility areas there, but everybody's like, she knows what's going on. We don't need to watch what's going on. Boy, it really sucks that we had to take out a $5 million bond this year. Well, at least Rita's force range is doing really, really well. Yeah. Okay. I'm jumping from one topic to the next. Sorry, guys. Okay. Yeah. Segregation of duties. If there's not proper segregation of duties in an organization, there are compensating controls that can actually be put into place in that. One of those would be management review and oversight of the transactions in that area. All right. What other procedures might have led to the discovery of fraudulent scheme masterminded by Campos? All right. So there's a couple of different areas that we could actually identify here. I was trying to focus on the technology areas, but Madeline, what'd your group say?
Doing a walkthrough, comparing employee files to payroll, and comparing a pay stub to payroll documentation.
Yeah, you actually are really close to where I was on there. So I kind of did the same thing. I was doing the calculation checks. So let's just talk about something that we haven't really talked about. So I think all of those are valid, but I want to kind of go in a little bit of a different direction as well. So when we talk about IT controls, what are the 2 categories of IT controls that are generally in place? We have access controls and application controls, right? Now, access controls tend to be a little bit more preventative, whereas application controls can be detective, but there are some application controls that can be preventative in nature. For example, what is a limit check in an IT system? So I basically say no number above this amount can be entered to the system without authorization. So, or even a logical checks, like you cannot enter more than 40 hours for a person to work without authorization. Anything above that has to be authorized by supervisory personnel. And you absolutely cannot enter over 168 hours under any circumstances, because that's just not physically possible. All right. I feel bad for anybody who actually works 168 hours a week. That's a long week right there. Anyway, yeah, so field range checks, we can talk about that, and limit checks. Also, some basic recalculations have done some work, some work here. Yeah, if we go in and we look at the payroll system, we say, all right, this person works $7 an hour for 40 hours a week. Their paycheck was $1 million. Yeah, there's something, the math does not work here. The math is not mathing here. So some basic recalculation procedures, I think, could have also gone a long way to actually test this. Yeah, so a lot of different ways we could approach this, but the simple truth is it was a small audit area. It was one of the focus, and I think there was an illusion that this person had knowledge of everything that's going on, so there was not nearly the need to focus on this, which that's usually where fraud will flourish. All right, we're done for today. We've got CPA prep and quiz on Friday. We'll see y'all then. Oh, and don't forget about Bad Blood, not the Taylor Swift song.
For some reason, that's not the song I think of.